Last night, I recited some of the extensive list of the achievements and awards, accomplishments, scientific stuff that our Dr. Campbell has done. So I'm not going to go through that again tonight. You guys know all that. The main thing that's important for you to know is that he's a genius. Please welcome Dr. Colin Campbell.
Thank you, Jeff, for that very warm welcome. Wasn't that a fantastic lecture by Dr. Clapper? He really has a way of sort of curling things up and describing things in a fairly descriptive way, to say the least. I really like his ideas, and I think it would come as no surprise to you that everything I heard him say, I agree with 100%. And it's really nice that, and it's nice in a way that he's able to sort of identify those things that cause so much confusion, I think. And it's really important that we sort of get some clarification. And I think Dr. Clapper did a really good job on that. The one thing that he did say I really liked, could almost be the title for my talk: you can't do one thing. I really like that philosophy, because in biology it's far more than one thing. Things work together, and that's more or less the topic that I want to consider with you. Because our ignoring that idea, both in my field, in experimental research and nutrition and so forth, as well as in the practice of medicine, that idea of assuming that we can do one thing, like A going to B to C to D and so forth and so on, that's been a really serious problem. And it's caused a lot of problems for us through the years. So I want to consider with you some sort of basic science again, and I hope you don't mind my doing this. Talk a little bit about the basic science as I learned it over the years, and came obviously out to the same place that Dr. Clapper is referring to, and others like us. So let me just start out first by talking about what do we think is the definition of contemporary nutrition. When we think about nutrition in a way, it's a topic that, a lot of people want to use that word, and many people have different opinions, of course, but it is a consideration, and that's really what I want to focus on. Define nutrition in a way in which we can use it that's reliable as far as the underlying biology is concerned. Let's start out with this idea. The public is very confused about nutrition. I think Dr. Clapper's presentation, in fact, illustrated that point. We got so many things that are so arguable, and so we argue all the time. We waste a lot of effort talking about these kind of details, it seems to me. Also, nutrition is not taught in medical schools. I don't know of a single medical school in the United States that really teaches nutrition. Many don't even offer an elective course opportunity, or not even a lecture, maybe. I know medical schools that don't even do that. So nutrition is not in medicine, really. It's a serious problem. And so the question I want to pose for your consideration, why not? Why is it not there? I think that I have a feeling for, to some extent, why that's so, from a fairly fundamental, sort of more intellectual point of view, that helps us to understand why that's so. Actually, the majority of my lectures in the last 2 or 3 years have been to medical schools. That's really quite exciting. I'm finding that in the medical schools, they're beginning to warm up to this kind of consideration, this kind of idea. And I'm tickled to death that this is actually the case. That leads me to say something else, too. When I talk about the difficulties we have in this field, whether it's in biological research or in medical practice, I don't want to talk about individuals. I want to talk about the system within which we live that actually tends to lead us to think certain things that, in fact, perhaps we should not. So in any case, it's not taught in medical schools. That's the question I pose. Research funding also is almost non-existent. The National Institutes of Health, which actually funded virtually all of my research over the years, none from industry. The National Institutes of Health is made up of 29, I think the number is 29 right now, 29 different institutes. It's a plural, National Institutes of Health. There's one for cancer, one for heart disease, and so forth and so on. Do you know, of those 29 institutes, there's not one called the Institute of Nutrition. Just stop and think about that. Our leading biomedical research agency in the United States, and I would argue in the entire world, does not give emphasis to nutrition. They'll argue, like the National Cancer Institute, which funded most of my research over the years, they will say, oh, we do some nutrition research, but actually it's only about 2 or 3% of the total budget. And most of the money for that is used to test, has been used to test the effect of individual nutrients. I don't consider that nutrition, that's pharmacology. That's not nutrition. So nutrition is actually missing from the narrative as far as the professional community is concerned, from my perspective. And I think it's really quite a serious problem. Nutrition is shortchanged by that concept I refer to as reductionism, where we basically are looking at one thing at a time. And that's what, in fact, almost has been the definition of science. Good science is that kind of science that actually, quite frankly, practices what I refer to as reductionism. You know, we measure things precisely. We know exactly what we're doing. We control experiments. We do all of this kind of thing that actually focus our attention on the effect of individual nutrients. And so as a result, the emphasis is basically on out-of-context details. And therein, and with a massive amount of detailed information we now have, therein lies the opportunity for people to have various and sundry opinions about a same set of data, if you will. And that, in turn, whatever opinion people tend to have, is largely driven by personal considerations. A lot of bias, depending on our cultural backgrounds and things like this. So this is what we're doing. We're emphasizing out-of-context details, which I refer to as the concept of reductionism. Not a new term, not mine, of course. It's been used before by many, many people. I just want to draw your attention to that concept, because it's something that, in fact, I don't think we paid enough attention to. So it basically has to do, reductionism has to do with the activities of individual nutrients, vitamin C, vitamin B, you know, some of the things that Dr. Clapper mentioned too. Individual nutrients, individual explanations for how they work, we refer to them as mechanisms. Individual outcomes, I mean, this disease, that disease, this health event, so forth and so on. So I think you're getting the drift that really nutrition is always so focused. Here, for example, is one way that we do this. You can't read the fine print here, I'm sure, but we make recommendations as to what is good nutrition, what is not. We call this recommended dietary allowances that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, RDAs. I mentioned that briefly yesterday. And so every 5 years, the National Academy of Science, the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Science, actually reviews the existing literature for the previous 5 years to see if they have to make some changes. And that's been going on since 1943. So it's a very official kind of activity. Scientists get together, the experts get together, look at the latest information, and come up with to see if, in fact, the recommendations for the intake of specific nutrients is still the same, or do they have something new? Call that RDAs. And here's just the title of one, that reference intake for thiamine, riboflavonoids, so forth and so on. So that's the sort of the root, that's the basis for the scientific determination, in a sense, of what is good nutrition and what is not, all hinging on deciding exactly how much we need of each of these individual nutrients. We translate that in turn into food labeling. Now this food labeling here is a little simpler than what it used to be, but it's still pretty complicated in many cases. Again, the labeling is focused on one thing at a time. I was actually on the expert panel that revised this consideration about 20 years ago. So I was arguing, I didn't say do away with labels, but I just wanted to say, you know, there's peaches in this jar, or there's strawberries, or something like that, without saying too much more. Because the labeling, I know there's some value for labeling, and my wife argues with me, says she wants to see something on there, but when she's shopping. But my point is we need to kind of keep it simple. Don't get over-exercised about looking at the detailed numbers on there. But keep in mind that the information that's on there largely directs our attention to specific nutrients, and we buy this one instead of that one because of this number is better than that number. So you take that with some measure of I was going to say some measure of salt, but that's not a very good idea. So now let's look again at another way of that we talk about individual nutrients. Here's just a sort of little table of the amounts of vitamin C in some different foods. And you can see the numbers on there. I mean, I guess I hope you can see the numbers. They come out to 3 significant figures in these cases, as if that third significant figure makes a difference. So they're ranked. We rank these foods. That's what's been done by the USDA, to rank the foods as to how much vitamin C it has. People look at that. You may have done it yourself. You look at that, oh, this food's got more vitamin C than this food, as if it is important. I would suggest that here is papaya, 185 milligrams of vitamin C. I'd like to ask the question, is 184, 183 not as good as 185? I mean, maybe, I don't know. Or is it really better than, let's say, some way down the line here with broccoli at 101? Is 183 really higher than 101? It is numerically, of course. But is there really a difference between these foods as far as the vitamin C content is concerned? You'll get my drift in a moment when we look at this a little more carefully. Now, I want to give you a couple of examples of how so-called reductionism has cost us hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more. And is this the source? This is largely the source, I'm going to argue, that has to do with the problems we have, in fact, with the healthcare costs. And the fact that let me leave that just for a moment. Here, I got 2 examples. I could choose 100, or hundreds, I should say, almost at this point in time, looking back historically at some of the mistakes we've made in science. Or I should say, more appropriately, the mistakes, the way science gets interpreted into the marketplace. So these 2 examples are just two, keep that in mind. But I chose these 2 because they do have some relevance and some history that's kind of interesting to make my point. Beta-carotene, you know beta-carotene, I think. It's the pro-vitamin A, so it's said. It's a pro-vitamin A. The real vitamin A is a derivative called retinol, and various chemical derivatives like retinoic acid and retinal and so forth and so on. So and that's called the real vitamin A. And it's also said, I might add for your consideration, that it's always been said we need this much vitamin A. Well, first off, I have to suggest that vitamin A, the retinol part, that's not a vitamin. Vitamin is something we have to consume because we can't make it. We can make retinol. How? We consume the real vitamin, which is beta-carotene. Beta-carotene is the real vitamin, and some other similar related carotenoids, if you will, that gets converted by our bodies according to the body's infinite wisdom to how much vitamin A we want. So there's nomenclature here involved that really turns out to be quite interesting and quite frankly, a little bit misleading. But enough said about beta-carotene. Let me tell you just a little story here that occurred starting in the late 70s, early 80s. And I knew, in fact, several of these authors we talked about at the time, but somehow it didn't quite register. Beta-carotene is an excellent antioxidant, as many of you may know. It's like vitamin C, except vitamin C is water-soluble and beta-carotene is fat-soluble. But in any case, we got these things in plants that are really good antioxidants. So antioxidants, by definition, are those kind of chemicals that actually destroy, among other things, they destroy the so-called oxygen-free radicals, which are very reactive kinds of materials. They have a role in biology, but when our body produces an excess of oxygen-free radicals, it tends to increase aging. It tends to increase cancer. It tends to play a role in heart disease. So oxygen-free radicals is sort of like rusting. You know, if we have too much oxygen-free radicals, we get more rusting. It's that simple. Antioxidants are those things that kind of stop that, inhibit it, block it, whatever. So beta-carotene is a good one. It's an excellent antioxidant. We've known that since the 1960s. So oxygen-free radicals, for example, that are produced, here's a classic example, is produced during smoking. When we inhale smoke, you know, full of chemicals, as you know, of course, it tends to increase the production of oxygen-free radicals, which in turn plays a role in our getting lung cancer. That's part of the hazards of smoking. The production of oxygen, one of the mechanisms by which we actually have problems. So there's two ideas. Beta-carotene destroys these oxygen-free radicals. They, in turn, promote lung cancer. Wow, perfect. What we need to do, since we know that kind of information, now we're going to give some beta-carotene, to smokers, let's say, and reduce the risk of getting lung cancer. And in fact, there were human studies that were done during the 60s and 70s comparing the consumption of beta-carotene-rich foods with the risk of getting lung cancer. And it turned out that when you look at this kind of information, those individuals consuming the most beta-carotene-rich vegetables, if you will, those consuming the most beta-carotene, they had lower risk of lung cancer, even though they were smoking. So it kind of fit the bill. Everything is kind of sort of resonating, working together here, those three ideas. That in turn said, okay, let's do a study. Let's do a study, giving some beta-carotene to people, and that should really help. This was at the beginning of quite frankly, at the beginning of the vitamin supplement industry. And I personally got involved in some of that at the very beginning because the vitamin supplement industry really got its toehold in our society in the middle 1980s. In the middle 1980s, when they, in fact, spending a lot of money, seeing a great opportunity, took advantage of an article that I had written, co-authored at least for the National Academy of Science, on diet, nutrition, cancer. We said in that report, and that was the first one that concerned the relationship of diet and cancer, we said it was a good idea to eat vegetables and fruits and low-fat diets. Made a lot of news, and we said the reason for that is because vegetables have all these good things in it, including antioxidants and so forth and so on. We explicitly said in the executive summary, this does not apply to individual nutrients. This is 1982. But the industry looked at that and ignored what we said. They just threw it to the wind, and they wanted to be able to advertise these antioxidants in pill form and other nutrients in pill form in order to prevent cancer. That's what they did. The National Academy of Science then asked the Federal Trade Commission to take the industry to court. And they sued them and said they were making false claims because they were making big claims in major magazines. And I was the one who was asked to be the chief witness on the stand at the time, countering the claims that they were making. So I kind of get it on the ground floor to see, how does this work? How does science get translated? So all of this, and beta-carotene was the first one that they wanted to choose. We're going to take beta-carotene, and they had in mind of making a big industry at the time. So here's the study that was done, one of the first. It was repeated at least 2 more times, if not in 3 or 4, depending on how we count them. Here's a study that was done, actually, joint study between U.S. and Finnish scientists, funded by the National Cancer Institute. It kind of went out with some fanfare, a very exciting possibility to see what might happen. They had 29,000 male smokers, and they followed them up after they started the study. They followed them up for 5 to 8 years, looking and expected to see that those who had more beta-carotene intake would have less lung cancer. And it turned out at the end of the study, the food beta-carotene, that's the beta-carotene in the food, and there's ways of estimating how much they were consuming, of course. The food beta-carotene was associated with a decrease in lung cancer of about 19%. Not a big change, but it's significant. It certainly was statistically significant. So the more beta-carotene consumed in the form of carrots and all this kind of stuff, the lower was the risk of lung cancer cases occurring. However, when they gave the supplement beta-carotene, more or less the same amount, calculated at that level, the beta-carotene actually increased lung cancer. Boy, wasn't that a conundrum? I remember the howl that went up in the press, in the scientific community, and the medical community, especially in the industry, everybody accusing everybody else of dishonesty and fraud and on and on and on. It was really a Donnybrook, actually, when this information came out. Nobody wanted to believe that. How could that possibly be? Beta-carotene is good stuff, put in this pill, actually having the opposite effect of actually increasing lung cancer. So it became really quite a celebrated case. Also, beta-carotene, not by much, but certainly significant, because big study. The beta-carotene actually increased all-cause mortality, total mortality. Beta-carotene is good stuff doing that bad thing. So that really raised a serious question about what in the world is going on here. Since then, there's been lots of studies done on some of the individual nutrients. Dr. Clapper referred to that, incidentally, too. He had a couple of on here that I didn't have. But in any case, here's the publications. Here's some other nutrient supplements. Vitamin E increases hemorrhagic stroke by 74%. And here it was being taken. In fact, the Harvard researchers, my friends at Harvard, used to say, if there was one thing that they wanted to advise people to do, take vitamin E, because they're taking vitamin E supplements. That's Harvard. We're Cornell. They're Harvard. They make mistakes all the time, but anyhow, that's what they're advising. And so, you know, the study was done, and vitamin E increases hemorrhagic stroke by 74%. Isn't that a shocker? Calcium and vitamin D has been shown in some studies to actually increase heart disease events. Calcium and vitamin D? I mean, isn't that kind of weird? I mean, some studies, a lot of studies show no effect, if you will, but, you know, some studies have a tendency to actually increase heart disease risk. Vitamin E increases the risk of prostate cancer by 17% as well. So, and now I should tell you, there's quite a lot of studies after some 20, 25 years since that all started. Quite a lot of studies now showing that these supplements, these nutrient supplements, are not doing what they were intended to do. In spite of the fact that 40 to 50% of adults in this country are consuming multivitamin supplements. It's a big deal. It's a major industry. It's an $11 billion industry a year. It keeps on going right down the track, in spite of the information that this kind of has been showing. So now, just give you just quickly a summary of some of the studies that actually have been published in recent years. I want to make a point here about this, that some of the studies that have been done in recent years, sort of summarizing all these results from many different studies. Many different studies. And here's one having 67 randomized trials. A total of a big number, 250,000 people, summarizing all the results. And here's what that report said. And I should say, the investigators of this particular report were inclined to want to find a beneficial effect of vitamins. So I think it's a really reliable and reasonably honest statement. They said, and conservative in a sense, there's no evidence to support antioxidant supplements to prevent mortality in healthy people or patients with various diseases. That's a pretty strong statement right up front in the summary part. Beta-carotene, vitamin A, vitamin E significantly increase mortality. So then there was another one. And here's one that might catch your attention a little more in a more interesting way. It's omega-3 fats. You know, everybody wants to know about omega-3 fats. We're going to do good things for that, for sure, because there's some evidence, like beta-carotene, if we get more exposure to omega-3, so the story goes, we have lower risk for heart disease and a few other things that they seem to dream up. So here's basically 89 studies, a couple different kinds of study designs, randomized clinical trials and cohort studies, and you can see about 600,000 subjects. I think you'd agree that's a massive amount of information. A lot of money being spent to investigate this. So omega-3 fats do not have a clear effect on total mortality, combined cardiovascular events, or cancer. They're using conservative language here. There's a very august body trying to be, you know, not being outrageous about saying things, and this is what they said. But they also said, although not statistically significant, clinically important harm through cancer, increased cancer risk, could not be excluded. The data suggested they showed an increase. When you look at omega-3 fats, if anything, cancer risk goes up. If anything, it goes up. So far, it hasn't proven to be significant, but sure, it's not going down. And if there's any effect at all, it could well be associated with an increase in cancer risk. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact this was published in 2006. 2006. The last one was 2008. What is this, 2013 now? 7 years later. And you have a lot of people telling you about you taking omega-3 supplements and telling you all these wonderful things. You bring this to their attention, they want to dismiss it. I mean, this is a massive amount of studies and a lot of details showing this kind of effect. For some reason, it really seems to I mean, regardless of what science does and how they summarize it and publish it, if you will, it seems to take a long time before it really reaches the public. Somehow we sort of miss out on that. Here's another one on omega-3 fats, either obtained from fish, in respect to type 2 diabetes, and again, it's 2009, 4 years ago, when all this was summarized. Here we have almost 10,000 cases of diabetes. That's a lot. That's a big study, too. Or, all told, about 3 million person years of follow-up time. Again, a massive amount of information. You've got to take it seriously. And so what we saw in this, or what they concluded from these studies, was that as we increase omega-3 consumption from the baseline, let's say from the lowest level, give that 1, the next highest level, 5% up, then 17% up, then 24% up. It's a nice dose-response relationship. The higher the omega-3 concentration or consumption, we actually see this remarkably and highly significant increase in type 2 diabetes. Omega-3 being associated with more type 2 diabetes? When it's said, maybe it should be doing the reverse. Fish intake even has, in this particular summary of lots of stuff, had a 22% higher risk for diabetes when people consuming 5 servings a week are compared to some people consuming less than 1 serving a week. So again, here's the evidence of omega-3 fats. What do you do with this? I mean, this is pretty important, I think. Yet we're being just barraged with public information. And much of it, unfortunately, comes from the medical community that maybe it's okay, maybe it's a good idea. But this information here will not go away. I mean, there's a massive amount of information that has been developed. 2009, of course. So anyhow, I think the industry would like very much for us to think of having food this way for the future. I don't know, it's just a possibility. So that's beta-carotene. Now I say I could make so many statements about or beta-carotene and individual nutrient supplements. This one way where we focus on one thing at a time, and one property, make some conclusions, but when you actually test it, it doesn't work. This has been largely, in fact, the activity of science. Now here's another one. This one here, this one goes back many years. And to discuss this particular point here is a little bit complex, and I hope you can bear with me. I hope I can articulate it the right way. But it's really important, and I wanted to show it because it is one having to do with the way we have tended to think for decades about dietary fat, high-fat foods, low-fat foods, stuff like that. Back in the 1950s, 60s or so, there was a fellow professor at University of Minnesota by the name of Ansel Keys, who found in the so-called 7-country study that you may have heard about, that the higher the fat concentration in the diet, the higher was the risk for heart disease. A little later on, it found, too, that the higher the fat intake, the higher the risk it seemed for some cancers, maybe, too. But that observation in the late 50s, early 60s, by Ansel Keys, higher fat diets, more heart disease. Particularly, it was said it was a saturated fat that's commonly found in animal foods that led to increases in heart disease, okay? Total fat, saturated fat, and even cholesterol. The higher the cholesterol consumption, more heart disease. You've heard that story. It's part of our narrative. It's part of our brain. And we don't even question it. The high fat, high saturated fat, more heart disease. Well, finally, in 1975, a friend of mine, the late Ken Carroll, really a brilliant scientist, I think, for his time, pulled together some data and published it in a rather more impressive way. In this case, comparing total fat intake with breast cancer risk in different countries. Saw the same thing that Ansel Keys had said, really, for heart disease. And also there were similar studies for colon cancer, like breast cancer, like heart disease. And we saw the same thing. And I think you would agree here, that's pretty impressive when you compare a bunch of different countries with different levels of fat consumption from the diet compared to the risk of breast cancer. That's pretty impressive. I talked to Ken about this. He had the original data. And I saw he played with it a little more with his permission. He agreed with this. So it's, some of this is mine, some of this is his. One of the things I wanted to do was to draw a best fit line through that information, the so-called regression line. And something interesting came out. Look at that line. I mean, in science, to see something better than that, you almost never do. That's really impressive. The higher the fat consumption, the higher the breast cancer risk. Don't consume high-fat diets. That's the story. The public responded in a massive way. We used to think whole milk was okay. Then we got to 2% milk and 1% milk and skim milk. Skim milk was the best thing, right? And that was coming out in the late 60s, early 70s. People stopped consuming lard and butter massively. It dropped precipitously. And they started consuming the oils of plants that was said to be better. Corn oil, Wesson oil, and things like that. And that's when that industry started picking up speed, because the plant oils were said not to have this relationship. And so everybody was using plant oils. But you know, you couldn't spread corn oil on the bread very well. So what they did, they bubbled hydrogen through it, converted these polyunsaturates in the plant oils over to a more saturated form so that it could be solid at room temperature. And then you could spread it, and then we had margarine. So what I'm talking about here is a really a major development in the public mindset and the practice in the industry. When it started out, first, just a simple plot of heart disease, a higher fat intake associated with these diseases, particularly saturated fat, associated with more disease. Unsaturated fat, present in plant oils, for example, were said to be good. So this arose in our mind. Polyunsaturates from plants are good. Saturated fats from animals are bad. So coming back to this line here that's drawn, there's something technical I want to show you. That line comes down through here, and if we take it theoretically, let's look at it a little more carefully. It crosses a line down here. What this is sort of saying, there's a threshold here. What this is saying is that theoretically, we could consume up to about, 6-7% total fat in our diet, and we would not expect to see any breast cancer. The same thing sort of true for heart disease and colon cancer. And I'm sort of interpreting things here a little bit closely, but it turns out that, incidentally, that's about the amount of fat in the diet is quite nicely. It works quite well. We don't need more than about 6-7% fat. We're actually, as you may know, we're at 35%, 40%. So we don't need much fat in our diet, really. That's the level that we see, theoretically at least, no disease. Now, I wanted to know, too, and I was asking Ken this at the time when we first started talking about this, what did he have any data on plant fat and animal fat, kind of breaking them apart? We knew what total fat looked like. So here's for plant fat. For the same countries, same data set, you don't see any relationship. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference how much plant fat we're consuming in theory. It makes some difference, but, and I'll come back to that, it's a little bit complicated, but in any case, plant oils, or plant fat, if you will, did not seem to have that relationship. So no association of plant fat, which is the polyunsaturated fats, with heart disease, okay? Animal fat, look at that. That's where the original line for total fat came from. That line that I showed you previously for total fat really is attributed to the consumption of animal fat. So that really, made a mark on the public consciousness. Certainly don't eat fatty animal foods. That played out incidentally on the farm when I was growing up. In fact, I know when it came along, we were measuring milk content by the fat. We were measuring milk quality by its fat content on the farm. And that's why we bred animals. That's why we sold milk. The more fat, the better. And so when this came out, all of a sudden people were talking about low-fat milk, skim milk, stuff like that. We thought people were crazy to say such a thing because the whole-fat milk was supposed to be the best. But there was a big shift in the public mindset about going from whole-fat foods and milk in particular to low-fat. That was supposed to be good. Okay, in any case, this just shows, here we see that line. So the association with animal fat, there's no threshold. What they're saying, if we look at this literally, as soon as we put a little bit of animal fat in the diet, we start to see the disease. So here everything so far is kind of falling in place. Things that you probably have heard before. But in that whole exercise, Now I'm going to go back to the original chart. In that whole exercise here, we see this nice relationship. There was a thing that wasn't discussed very much, if at all. And this number here comes from a different kind of study, a really big international study that by some friends at Oxford University of mine, who showed, for in fact, that the correlation between animal fat, or total fat in this case, the correlation between total fat and animal protein is almost perfect. I mean, 94% correlation is just about it. So when that first paper came out and said, you know, total fat related to breast cancer, it could just as well be a correlation for animal protein intake. So in the first instance, they focused on fat. That's what got the public. They did not focus on the thing that could easily be animal protein. So animal protein got kind of sidetracked because we don't talk about animal protein that way. Animal protein is important. Just to come back to that particular point. More to the point, the animal protein relationship with fat is really a reflection of animal food intake. And this is a part of history that, quite frankly, fell through the cracks. There's this relationship that was focused on fat that caused all this change in our eating patterns actually was a reflection of animal food intake as much as anything else, and more so. But that story was really never told. It was surmised to some extent, but really wasn't explained, it wasn't told, it wasn't emphasized, so people tended not to know about all of that. Oh, that color doesn't show up, something good. But here, I want to just draw your attention to a kind of interesting way to look at this data. Let's go back to this chart again here, where see this threshold is? And what we're saying theoretically is maybe 6 or 7% fat is okay, it's good. It turns out that's the level of fat we generally get in whole food plant-based diets. That's what we generally tend to get. Nice to note an inflection here, in this case, to show an animal protein, if you will, but that shape of that curve. So animal, whole food plant-based diet takes care of our fat needs, just like it takes care of our protein needs that I showed you from an entirely different sort of kind of analysis from the laboratory. And animal protein intake is what actually triggers all of this going up this way, or animal food. So all of a sudden now we have a convergence of a couple of different graphs, going like this and up like that. We can see it for fat, we can see it for protein, all focused on animal food. We can see the same thing for some beta-carotene and stuff in plants, except it goes like that and like that. So all of a sudden this threshold concept, that point, was really telling us something really important, making a real distinction between animal and plant-based foods. And so that's what I showed previously, yesterday, that for protein, you get up to about 10% or so. That's enough provided by plant-based foods. You go beyond as animal-based foods. So, you know, the evidence is coming together in a piecemeal fashion, first on fat, and then on protein, and I could tell you a lot more about saturated fat and polyunsaturated fat. It all started to come together into one sort of story, beautiful story, that was really, really convincing from my perspective at least. So it comes to a point where what has contemporary nutrition meant? Just a couple of ideas here. And I think these two things, as I look back over the history of the last, I feel like I'm part of history, almost been around long enough. I don't know whether I want to admit that, but anyhow. So there's a couple of ideas that I think have really dominated our thinking in this field, both among professionals and the public. There's no difference, really. I mean, professionals don't get training in this area, you know, so what's the difference? So, contemporary nutrition, the way we think about it, as I say, to some extent unconsciously, but also consciously, we've been overemphasizing protein consumption. And that has meant, for most people, mean meat. Because the protein was first discovered way back in 1839. It was found that came from meat. So we've had that in our consciousness for almost 200 years. That protein means meat. Protein means meat. That's it. Well, we know now protein's in plants, and so it really led us down to the path in a very strange way. The other thing is that this thought is this idea that nutrients act independently. So we study them independently. We study each one nutrient And I say that's the best of science. That's the science that gets funded. I know well this because I was actually on panels that actually determined among the proposals that were being submitted by my colleagues. We were doing this for the National Institutes of Health. We were the ones that actually determined which grants get the highest priority and which ones get funded. And there was a statement we used to say, or was said at the time, if somebody came in and looked at a bunch of stuff and a bunch of data, we called it a fishing expedition and never got funded. Or was it called maybe sometimes a shotgun approach, to things. And so that was considered bad science. I'll make this point. That's considered bad science when I look at the complexities of things. Good science is focused on one thing at a time. It was a really important distinction here. So it pervaded, it was very pervasive in the research committee. It became also pervasive in the medical practice community as well. Now I want to just share with you something new that I find that I think can help us to get us out of this rut, out of this, in a sense, out of this swamp that we've been in, was creating this massive amounts of information that oftentimes gets so confusing and leads to so many different ideas. Just going to take this little schematic, this little tour with you on what happens to nutrients when we consume them. First off, they're digested, go in the intestinal tract, and what that basically means is in our intestine, the nutrients are kind of being disaggregated or separated from the food, releasing them so they can get absorbed. The percent that gets digested of it, you could take almost any individual nutrient and show this to be true. The percent of an individual nutrient that actually gets digested can vary by 2 or 3 or 4-fold at any moment in time. I mean, that's a big range. It's not a finite number. It changes according to the conditions. It's really kind of interesting. So whatever is digested, released into the intestinal tract so it gets absorbed, whatever is, then it gets absorbed. And the percent that actually gets absorbed, that too varies a lot. It varies a lot. The body decides, I want this much, leave the rest go out, picks out. In other words, that can vary by at least a couple folds, 3-fold or something like that. So here's one variation in the first instance, added to a second variation, now where we're getting to. Can we really tell what percent of a nutrient actually gets into the bloodstream at a moment in time? But then it gets transported in the blood. And some things actually get transported in a free form. These nutrients can act right now. Beta-carotene is one of them. But some of them actually get carried on a carrier, in which case they're inactive. So we got 2 forms of transport in the blood. We got an active form, we got an inactive form. So the body decides what percent is active and what percent is inactive. Now we're piling on a third stage, we're piling on yet more variation in theory. Then the body decides where it's going to send it, which organ, liver, pancreas, lung, whatever. Here's another decision. Somehow, somebody in our body, or somehow our body's intrinsically and in infinite wisdom is choosing how much to go here, how much to go there. Again, that's another level of complexity that's hard to comprehend. Finally, it gets into our cells. Inside the cells, that's when, if you think this is complex by now, imagine what happens inside of a cell. It's explosive. Because these nutrients can get metabolized to form a whole host of different kinds of metabolites in some cases at different rates, depending on what each of these metabolites actually do inside the cell. So again, the complexity is building. We're not even now able to comprehend, in a sense, what's the relationship between how much nutrient we have on the end of our fork compared to how much is actually being delivered to our tissues. Some of it gets stored. The amount gets stored compared to the amount that gets used. That varies too. And of course, some of it gets excreted. Now my point is this. If you stop and think about the numbers of that, you can actually find these data, you can look at the variation that occurs, the variance, I should say, that occurs, the range of concentrations that actually occurs. It turns out the body adjusts the amount of nutrient passing through each stage. Isn't that an interesting idea? And we know a lot about these mechanisms. We don't think about them the right way, I must confess. But we know that the body has mechanisms in the intestinal wall. It has mechanisms to kind of adjust things, and it's done it in a way in which it results in what we call homeostasis. So the body is always working to create whatever is the ideal level that it needs at that point in time, but the body is always adjusting the amount of nutrient passing through each stage. It's amazing. I mean, just you have to kind of think about that a little bit to realize how significant that is. And there's no way, at least to this, there's no way to know the amount of nutrient at the functional site. We can't tell that. There's no relationship, essentially no relationship, at least in our minds. There's no relationship between the amount that's in the food in the first place and the amount that's functioning at the level that it needs to function. That's a huge level of assumptions based on very reductionist kinds of thinking, measuring things very precisely. It's a waste of time almost. It's almost a total waste of time. That we're trying to make something definite that is indefinite in many ways. And so who's creating this indefinite sort of nature of things? That is nature. That is nature. The body in its infinite wisdom is doing this, is deciding at any moment in time, and this can be within seconds, microseconds. The body's deciding how much I want to go here, how much there, I want to convert this or that. The body's doing this all the time. We know we know the qualitative mechanism, physical mechanism work. We don't stop and think about what this means in terms of actual numbers that we all get wrapped up in. So that's nutrition. That's nutrition. It's not a reductionist science, even though we try to make it a reductionist science. It's not. And it creates enormous confusion. I've got to come back to this concept of the infinite wisdom of the body to operate. That's what we need to recognize. I want to come back to that idea in a moment. But before doing so, let me mention medicine. The practice of medicine, Western medicine, if you will, is focused on the idea of reductionism once again. They even take it a step further and make it even worse, to be honest about it. Reductionism in medicine basically is encouraged by people deciding which exactly disease has been diagnosed. So we have an ICD code, or which procedure is going to be used, the CPT codes, if you will. That's for, I mean, this serves a purpose, by the way. I don't want to tear it down completely, but it basically encourages us to think about one thing, one disease, one procedure, one this, one that. And the standard of care in medical practice is still a good idea. I don't want to challenge that. But what it's doing is basically structuring our thinking in very narrowly ways. It makes us think in silos. You know, we got this idea for this, or we got this idea for this, and this idea for that, and we'll measure it exactly, and we'll be scientific about it, which is nonsense itself for the most part. So we get trapped in this concept of reductionism. And here's just some examples here. I mean, in medicine, for example, let's talk about that, or medicine or biology. We think about cancers being caused by specific carcinogens. That is really, quite frankly, way off the mark. We think about specific genes being involved, and so we identify which genes. The whole genetic thing, as you know, has exploded. Now, you know, science wants to find every gene, what it does, and we're going to change that gene, and we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. And I've been a fairly strong critic of that whole approach to genetic engineering, if you will, and it's at the basis of a lot of our thinking. We tend to think in such simplistic ways of identifying which of the 25,000 genes does what. It's such a silly idea. And I'm going to come back. You're hearing me sort of tear down reductionism and science. I'm going to come back and tell you there's a place for it, but we're not using it that way. So we have specific biomarkers like blood cholesterol is related to heart disease. Yeah, it sort of is. In population studies, blood sugar is related to, you know, diabetes risk. Yes, it sort of is. And we have specific diseases, as I said, identified by their codes. And so this all encourages the discovery and use of specific drugs. That's the new layer. We think in this way. If we can identify which mechanism causes which disease, which rate-limiting mechanism, then we can make a chemical. We can find a chemical to stop it. That is the ultimate in reductionist thinking. And so virtually all the chemicals we find that might be useful in the short run, you know, most of all of them come from plants, interestingly. But we can't make those chemicals into products that make us money because you can't patent it. So now we bring into question concerning intellectual property protection. We take the chemicals out of plants, we find, oh, this is pretty good. This pushes down cholesterol levels. This is kind of neat. But we can't take the original material, really. We have to make a derivative, a chemical derivative of it. Now it's labeled a drug. So the drug industry, in fact, is resting on the idea that we have all these synthetic foreign chemicals being taken to do various and sundry things that we see in the initial stages as being somewhat helpful. We see that, and we keep on taking them. In that context, when we have this enormous degree of complexity, especially when we use one thing that's a foreign to the body, which requires detoxification, all kinds of things. When we think of it that way, then it's so obvious that every single drug that's ever going to be invented and every one that has been invented has side effects. Every drug has side effects. Because we can't just predict just one thing. Yeah, we can get a lot of information, predict one thing like that, but it has all these side effects because in a complex system, the effect tends to ripple out, involving different kinds of mechanisms. So we got, all these side effects, quite frankly. The body, now maybe I can bring this concept in right now. I have basically become impressed with the idea that our body has an infinite wisdom to choose what it wants at any moment in time. And it does it, I say, on a second-by-second basis, on a microsecond, nanosecond basis, to decide every moment in time what to do with what. In that context, the body is always trying to create health. That's a given. That's a fundamental law. The body is always trying to create health. Even when we assault our bodies with all kinds of stuff, as Dr. Copper pointed out, we assault ourselves with stuff that we don't need and we have to get rid of it and the body does this and does that. But basically, the body is intrinsically, the default position of the body is to try to create health. All we need to do, get our heads out of the way for one thing, and just choose the kind of food that provides the kind of things to basically optimize the body's ability to be able to do these kinds of things. We'll show you just a little bit about a cell. I really got fascinated with this concept actually many years ago because at that time we were focused on working on reactions inside the cell as a means of trying to understand something about cancer, I should say, or particularly trying to understand how chemicals might cause cancer. And so let me just share with you something about the cell, because I find this here. Here's the world. Here is the world. This is where all of a sudden what I just said really begins to make sense. It's nature, in a sense, glorified. Here's the cell with all this three-dimensional structure, obviously. Got all these different parts in here, the nucleus and centrioles and microsomes and lysosomes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these. We talk about these things all the time. You see them in the press. This subcellular component or particle does this and does that and so forth and so on. Some truths in all of that, of course. They definitely have different chores. But the point is that these things are all kind of working together in a synergistic and sort of almost symphonic way. And let's look at the cells for a moment. We're said to have between 10 and 100 trillion cells in our body. I haven't met the guy yet who actually counted those, but anyhow, somewhere in that territory. Somewhere it's a big number. It's beyond our comprehension. We've got a lot of cells in there operating simultaneously. Each cell, not visible, can't see with the naked eye, can easily sit on the head of a pin. Think about that. Every cell, you can't see it. But here it is, got all this stuff in here. Isn't that a lot of stuff going on that you can't see? The DNA in the nucleus for a single cell, if you stretch out this long chain, amounts to a chain length of about 1.8 miles. In this cell you can't see. Think about that. And then you look at the chain of this DNA chain, the double helix, and all these bases along here. There's infinite possibilities and combinations of the order in which these are all strung along this that makes genes. Each of us have our own set of genes. And so, in turn, that's the basis for starting the biological sequence or or cascade that results in disease events. So right there, look at those numbers. I mean, I could show you many other numbers. It's all quite exciting. Here's the DNA molecule. As I say, the DNA chain length per cell is 1.8 miles, each cell of which can sit comfortably in a head pin. Okay, the DNA chain length per human is around 70 round trips to the sun. Can you imagine that? I mean, now we're out in the territory. We can't even begin to think about it. It's way beyond our ability. Every person who ever lived on this planet, except for identical twins, had their own sequence of DNA bases. So we're all unique that way. We really are. Here's the DNA molecule replicating itself. This chain is unwinding, and one way is going to a new cell, and the other is going to another cell. And we got all these different bases, and the rates of synthesis of all these things, they put it back together again, is an amazing process in itself, where more than 700 of these bases, as it begins to have this single strand here and this new one is forming, it forms at the rate of 700 plus nucleotides or bases per second. This is happening so fast. We got the complexity consideration. We got the time sequence. This is just, it says, and it does it with exceptional rapidity and fidelity. It doesn't make mistakes. If it does make mistakes, the body has a way of correcting it. That's the default sort of position. It tends to correct it. And inside these cells, there's another sort of area that, I know this is getting a little bit deep for chemistry, I guess, but I really have to tell you because it does help to explain so much. In each of these 10 to 100 trillion cells, we got a bunch of different reactions, unlimited number of reactions, going this way and that way, assembling all these nutrients and this and that and everything else, some things it doesn't want there, wants to get rid of it, and so forth and so on. All of these reactions, you may have seen a metabolic chart, a map. It's just beyond comprehensive. And a single reaction is something like this. You got a chemical, or we call it a substrate. It produces a product, and as a result of the enzymes sitting there and converting that to that. So we got these enzymes sitting here converting this to this. Zillions of different substrates producing all these different products. The enzyme itself is really key. We've got, about 100,000 or more different kinds of enzymes in every cell. Different kinds. And just zillions of different kinds of molecules, obviously. We have all these different enzymes sitting there. Every enzyme is an entity unto itself, able to do its own thing. It catalyzes this reaction maybe, but maybe not that one. And so then we get into saying this enzyme, I find the world of enzymes to be so fascinating beyond belief because an enzyme is a big, relatively speaking, compared to the substrate, it's a big structure. It's a three-dimensional thing made up of it's a whole chain length of protein. All these amino acids and assembling, and it does it so it has a configuration. And the configuration is something like this. That is in a precise configuration. That happens to be one enzyme converting glucose to the energetic form of glucose, the glucose 6-phosphate. So these are all these little dots here, are individual amino acids that make up this chain length. And that structure right here, that structure has to be just so. If we change, a substrate might come in here, and go out there, comes in here, and the rate at which it goes from here to here, or from there to there, whatever, we don't know. The rate at which it goes through this enzyme varies enormously every nanosecond. The enzyme's twisting and turning a little bit, and organizing itself and adjusting the rate of synthesis and the rate of reactions. And that's another consideration you have to think about. All these infinite numbers of enzymes, all they're doing is able to change in a microsecond. Nutrients come in, they can sit on the edge over here. Some of them do, we call them cofactors. They sit there and they modify the change. You're talking about dynamism and a dynamic state. These enzymes come originally from genes. They have their own template to say what kind of enzyme is going to be produced. It first makes what is called RNA from the DNA. That in turn makes protein. These proteins are enzymes. And now we're building some more complexity on top of complexity. This is complex way up here and come down here. And all these reactions. I guess I probably said enough about complexity. Who can imagine? All this are going on at the same time. And yet we talk about it as if we're smart. That one thing at a time we talk about. We got caught up in these details. They were so crazy. I think we really just have to relearn, rewire our brains a little bit on some of this. So that's what I call holism, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We study the parts. We're not studying the whole. We're not even recognizing the relationship between parts and wholes. Parts are important. Science can do a great job in studying parts. So reductionism has its place. It's a very important place. We learn about what individual things do. We should recognize them for what they do, as they describe the whole, of which they are a part. Instead, we take the part out, we put it in a pill. Or we do something else with it. We commercialize it. If we can make some money, we take it out. We take it out of this context. And that's what we do. That's medicine. That's public understanding of nutrition, unfortunately. When in reality, we have to return to the concept of what is the body doing. It's all working as a whole, working together. I really mean when I say symphony, really that. You don't go to the orchestra to go hear a musical and see somebody sitting on the stage just banging away using one instrument, hitting one note throughout the whole procedure. Doesn't work. That's what we kind of do in science. And that's what we kind of do in medicine. So I'm exaggerating a little bit, but we tend to think that way. When in fact, all the notes put together, and that's just a very simple version of holism, put all the notes together, all of a sudden we got something that resonates. Beautiful. Has emotional effects on us. That's the symphony, instead of the parts. A tapestry in the wall. We can see a beautiful tapestry hanging out. The tapestry is made of threads. The tapestry is made of threads. Those threads are important. They are important because they define the tapestry. In science, we're working on the threads all the time. We're not seeing the tapestry, in a sense. So that's the difference between, I would argue, reductionism and holism. Medicine, in research, we use reductionist procedures to discover new chemicals, new drugs. Because we practice it that way, that's what we do. We take these chemicals and we treat ourselves with these chemicals. They may have some good effects for practical, I don't want to say throw out all drugs, I'm not saying that, but they may certainly have good effects, at least in the short term, help us out when we're in trouble. But then they don't tend to have long-lasting effects because eventually the body is coming back to its default position and saying, I want to get rid of that stuff. So tolerance builds up or other kinds of things come in and you get side effects. So the whole idea of using drugs is an end game that is actually an end game. It really is. It doesn't actually allow for biology to live as it wants. So the whole practice of medicine is, in fact, a reductionist procedure. And therein lies so many explanations of why we have side effects. We don't know why we get the side effects. We get so much argument, so much confusion, and we get results in the short term, and our medical system fails. We aren't practicing medicine in order to sustain and develop health. It's just not, it's built in structurally, it's not part of the game plan. We think it is, we try to kid ourselves. Whoops, sorry. So that's medicine. Nutrition is, we treat it in research as if it's a reductionist process. That's not the way to do it. We can learn something about it that way, but that's not the end game. We actually have invented those silly terms that I actually see in the popular press. We call it a nutraceutical. Can you imagine that? What did somebody have in their mind when they wanted to change a nutrient into a nutraceutical? That is a reductionist idea. So we talk about nutrition being a means of chemo-preventing disease. What does that mean? It's taking up the chemicals until the chemo-preventing disease. That was the justification of the vitamin supplement industry. Really a silly idea. All based on the idea that we could just work with one thing at a time, when in reality, the real practice of nutrition is holistic. Now the question is this. The reason that nutrition is not in the medical model, the reason it's not taught is because it's a different worldview. The real nutrition is holistic. It's holistic. It cannot fit within a reductionist paradigm. Oh yeah, we kind of stick it in there. Sometimes we call it alternative medicine. Alternative medicine, I really find that term disgusting. Because why should things that count be considered alternative? Why shouldn't they be considered mainstream, mainline? The alternative is what we're doing now. So this is what we're doing with nutrition, my science, really messing up the science. At best, it's like a second or third rate reputation within medical communities because it's holistic. We always heard all these years, holism, don't even mention that. We usually spell it with an H. And the reason we actually got upset with that, the reason science got upset with that, because it suggested faith-based ideas. And science and nutrition are like that. I mean, science and religion are like that, right? And science didn't want to deal with this holistic concept because it immediately suggested faith-based, personally biased decisions and decision-making. So when I was writing the book Whole and trying to think about this a little bit, I went to the dictionary, and I thought I was going to find a spelling that had the W in front of it, and I went back into old Oxford dictionaries and things like that. I couldn't find any place where the dictionary spelled it with a W. I said, okay, forget it. I'm going to put the W there anyhow, so the next dictionary will have the W there. Because I want just this concept to get out there and be recognized for what it is, creating health. This goes beyond. Here's the sort of, what should I say? I don't know the right word to use. But this suggests a worldview that we're not taking seriously. We could take it seriously and take it beyond our thinking. If this is the way the cell works, the cell is working. If we understood it, it teaches us a lesson. Cells talk to each other. All the things inside the cell, they talk to each other. Cells together, a bunch of different cells sort of cluster together in a different organ, they talk to each other. We call cell-to-cell communication. We have words for this. They talk to each other. They work together. And then an organ, which has different kinds of cells, we have different organs. These organs talk to each other too. Maybe about hormonal issues, maybe about neurological things, maybe about chemical things. But organs talk to each other. And we do it in microseconds. It happens. What's going on in the head, a pain, somebody, step on your toe, you know it immediately. I mean, the communication that goes on in our body is incredible. It happens almost instantaneously, which is a marvel in and of itself. And so you think then, okay, we got our bodies all working this way, it's really holistic. Wouldn't it be nice if we stopped to think about the whole bodies, each being a holistic object, could interact with other holistic objects? In other words, you could talk to each other and communicate with each other and have a more dynamic and more symphonic state of affairs. So that lesson can come up to the level of the individual. And it could also come up to the level of even societies of people, like different societies talking to each other, recognizing that we're all basically one. So this holistic concept, starting with the cell, all the way up through the hierarchy, to societies and beyond, to the universe, really becomes, in a sense, sort of like one. And when you think of it that way, then all of a sudden like this, misunderstanding nutrition can lead to environmental degradation. So that's a big, big issue, in case you haven't heard lately. Livestock production, just to give an example, now is good data showing, and an interpretation of this, responsible for more than 50% of global warming. Again, we're focusing on CO2, leaving its footprint. Reductionist thinking ignored this idea of methane and nitrous oxide from animals, just ignore it. But we can solve the global warming problem by stop eating meat, for example. And that's a big issue, arguable, according to many, but there's all kinds of degradations that occur. Excessive medical costs, we know that. Way over the top. We're spending so much money now and not getting anything in return because we're working on reductionist things one at a time. Because that makes money. We can fool people in making claims. We don't tell people about this other way of doing things that doesn't really cost us all that much. Unnecessary violence, obviously, that results from our greed and our striving to try to find the resources we need in order to eat, live, inappropriate research design, policy corruption. I mean, we can solve so many of the big problems that have arisen in recent times, but deciding just what to eat and deciding what is nutrition and really understanding nutrition and understanding what it is. And let's not get caught up in talking and arguing about, is 11% protein better than 8%? Or what is this carotenoid here? Is that better than that one? No, those are questions that are moot questions. They really move. Just eat whole plants. Here's some vegetables, and a lot of colored vegetables and legumes and whole grains, unless you've got some allergy to some grains, but whole grains and legumes and all that. You get everything. Let the body, just give it to ourselves, figure out how to make it tasty, live with it, enjoy life, instead of getting so caught up in working with all these individual nutrients. Hippocrates said this a long time ago. He knew what he was talking about. We are what we eat. Aristotle supposedly said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. How did these guys know this? That's what they were talking about. We kind of forgot. Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. You've heard that many times. I think we're rediscovering, in fact, what the ancient Greeks really knew. Now we're beginning to be able to describe this phenomenon using real scientific data. This is, I would suggest, there are echoes from 2,500 years ago. We better hear that voice, because we don't have another 2,500 years to relearn this lesson. So I'm going to argue that the single most important medical science of all, whether professionals or not professionals, is nutrition. It's simply understanding what is nutrition. It has this enormous capacity to reverse disease, certainly to prevent it. In many cases, reverse, certainly stymie its progression. So that's the story that I'm trying to tell in the book Whole. And to just finish off this one last thing, we're kind of proud of the fact we have an online course right now. It's not as good as it's going to be. We're making it a lot better. But we had one for 4 or 5 years, thanks to some students of mine who actually was lecturing on campus. They got together, and a couple of them are going to med school and decided not to go to med school. So I'm sorry I've had that influence on them. But they got together and wanted to pull together and put my lectures online. They did it, and so we had a rudimentary course that actually survived and done very well. As a matter of fact, it's an instructor-monitored discussion. Somebody may know this. How many of you have taken the course? I mean, there's some in here. Yeah, it's, you know, we can offer 30 Category 1 continuing medical education credits for professionals or CEUs for others. Of the 200 courses we partner, our foundation has partnered with Cornell, the agency, the part of Cornell that I'm still a faculty member at Cornell, so we have access as Cornell faculty. We partner with this agency of Cornell to make these courses. It's called eCornell, and they are now offering more than 200 courses. We're ranked #1 out of the 200. Which is, and that's only with a rudimentary, I would suggest, kind of offering. We're just now in the business of scaling up and offering a whole new sort of collection of different kinds of courses, different kinds of topics, all devoted to the idea of let's learn nutrition the way it should be in order to just sort of begin to describe what it can do. So thank you very much.